by the time you were three, your worldview had been largely shaped already, because that happens almost from the moment of birth, even before birth, and with your interactions with your primary caregivers. So the sense of the world being against me, or you being against the world, it's rooted in your nervous system, a baseline a working theory of yours embedded in your subconsciously. We're wired for certain emotions. It's interesting how we use those phrases, falling to pieces and couldn't keep it together. When you look at the brain and the human evolution as it determines the brain, we share with other mammals a number of emotional circuits. One of them is for grieving. One of the needs of the child is to be able to experience all the range of emotions that nature endowed us with, and to have those emotions witnessed and validated. That never happened to you in your first years of life. When it did happen in that therapist's office, it's not that you fell apart or went to pieces.
Yes.
It's that you experienced something very human and had that witnessed and accepted and validated by an empathetic presence, your therapist. And then all of a sudden your worldview changed. No, maybe the whole world is not against me. That's just the kind of experiences that people need. A child can't grieve alone. It's way too painful.
I am your host, Tommy Rosen, and today I have the joy and the honor of connecting with my friend, Gabor Maté. Gabor is a medical doctor, 5-time international best-selling author, humanitarian, and revered speaker and teacher. His book on addiction, the award-winning In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, is used as a text in many institutions of higher learning in Canada and the US. His most recent book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture, was 19 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and continues to be a #1 Canadian bestseller today. The thing that I want to add to his introduction here is that I have now interviewed Gabor. This is the 10th time. He has always been supportive of my work personally, and we have been able to collaborate in ways that have been positively transformational for the people in the Recovery 2.0 community. And I'm super grateful, Gabor, to have your presence once again, your wisdom and your love here with us today. Thank you.
Tom, it's great to be with you, as it was to be with you in person in your beautiful home in Topanga just a few months ago. And
yes,
I'm always glad to be working with you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to lay a small framework for why exactly we're here. In the United States, at least, we have focused on the front part of transformation that we refer to as rehab or treatment. We've created a system where someone will go if you could afford it, which means you're either from a wealthy family or you have very, very good insurance, which you can also afford. And you'll go to a place which is a very protective bubble for, say, 28 days, if the insurance company is willing to pay for that. And in that place, you'll have a schedule. You'll know exactly where you're supposed to be and what you're doing from 7 a.m. till about 10 o'clock at night. You'll be fed 3 meals a day. You'll be supported by a group of peers who are also going through the same work. You'll have one-on-one therapy, meetings, and different activities. And then after 4 weeks, you leave. And in our system, we know that about 2 million people are going to go into treatment this year. Approximately about 80% of them are going to relapse in the first 2 months out. Now, we could say the treatment process is broken, or we can look at the holistic way we're looking at the problem of addiction and say, well, we haven't considered the whole rest of somebody's life when they leave the protective bubble of treatment. Of course, we're only speaking about 2 million people, where there are tens of millions of people in the United States who need help for addiction in one form or another. So I just was wondering if we could start there we're calling this life beyond addiction because we think that we need to start focusing on the rest of people's lives. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Well, the first practical point that comes up, there was just an article in the New York Times this last Saturday about billing practices and how, even when it comes to paying for addiction treatments, so much of the money goes into the pockets of middle people who don't participate in treatment. They just sort of triage the care, and that even the caregivers tend to get paid less than these people who are doing the managing and the raking in the profits. I mean, the whole system is designed, apart from genuine attempts to help people, it's also a profit-making machinery, which obviously is not going to consider human needs as the top priority.
Yes.
But addressing your specific point, I'm just reading a book by a psychologist, very well-known psychologist, Dr. Ed Tronick of Harvard and other universities, and it's called The Power of Discord, and the importance of what we call mismatch, caregiver and infant mismatches, but then repair, where the relationship is repaired. And this happens in a micro basis several times a day, where the parent might have a moment of anger and there's a mismatch with the emotion, but then there's a repair. Now, where there is no sufficient repair after these mismatches, the child turns more and more to self-soothing and turns inward rather than social relationships. They don't feel comfortable being alone, but they can't be soothed in relationship either. And their capacity for self-regulation, which is to handle difficult emotions, doesn't develop properly. Now, in this very stressed society, as I point out in a number of my books, parents are less and less able to do that repair process with infants. Now, that means these kids that were self-soothing as infants are at great risk for self-soothing later on with addictive behaviors. But that's their way of dealing with the inner discomfort. 4 weeks in a rehab facility doesn't change that. So when you talk about life beyond addiction, we also have to look at life before addiction. And what are the internal capacities for self-regulation, for feeling comfortable with oneself that haven't developed in these people? So it's not just a matter of getting over the addictive behavior, it's also developing new capacities that should have developed much earlier on, which, for example, I mean, your mindfulness process and the yoga that you teach, on a certain level, on a deep level, it is about the capacity to self-regulate your nervous system without having to turn to external escapes or internal tuning out. And so life beyond addiction certainly means correcting the developmental deficits that were there in the life before addiction. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of programs.
Yes. Well, I'm listening to you say that, and I'm thinking to myself, if somebody even recognized what you just said as a counselor, therapist, social worker, nurse, or doctor, they would have to have some understanding of the basis of addiction, which we could say is based in trauma and childhood development issues.
Yeah.
But what do you do if you don't have that sensibility, that understanding as a counselor? You're just I say this because part of the issue is that a lot of people are very inexperienced. This is not, I'm not trying to put down this, really, I'm not trying to put down the system as a whole, because there are people that are trying to make a very positive difference in people's lives. Yes. But in order to help someone solve their trauma, they're going to have some sensibility about what trauma is.
Yes, they will. And they will also have to have some sensibility about how important the relationship, the therapeutic relationship is, not the therapeutic modality, but the quality of the relationship itself. Because it's in relationship that develop these capacities. And I mean, you're much more active in the addiction realm than I am these days, having retired from medical practice. And speaking and writing and doing other stuff. But you tell me, what is your impression when people join your programs? What is their experience with any kind of trauma-informed care prior to coming to you?
Hmm.
Did many of them or most of them have trauma-informed support, or was that something largely ignored? Now, in my experience as a physician was that so often I talk to people about their childhood traumas, and after sometimes decades of being in care, they'd say, "You're the first person who ever asked me about that stuff."
Hmm.
So
Yes.
what is your experience with that?
Yes, I'll answer that by telling you a story about my experience in treatment, actually.
Yeah.
My first 2 weeks in treatment, I was there for a total of 40 days. And my first 2 weeks, my attitude was me against them.
Yeah.
I came in beaten up. I'd beaten myself up in life, and I was incredibly humiliated. Humble would not be the word. Humiliated would be the word. I had humiliated myself. And had so much insecurity. I remember walking into the facility and thinking, well, if anybody had any question about whether I had ruined my life, now they don't have to question it anymore. You know, I really felt like I was at the bottom. 2 weeks into my experience, I had been seeing a therapist twice a week, very intensive sessions, one-on-one, in addition to some group sessions. But the one-on-one sessions, to your point, with my counselor was where things started to happen. And after 2 weeks, she had keyed into a part of my story. There was a woman who had been there for me in my childhood when my mother was not there for me. And that woman really, in a certain sense, raised me in a way. My mother certainly contributed as well. It wasn't like she was completely absent, but
Yeah.
in the home environment, this woman was my mother in many ways. Behind very traumatic events, she stopped working with our family after she had been with us for 5 years. So she was with me from around age 3 to age 8. At 8 years old, she left. 2 years later, I was 10. My mother told me that she had heard from my caretaker, this woman, our nanny, as we would call her, our housekeeper nanny, that she had brain cancer. Literally the day after she told me that, I was out on the street in New York City. I ran into her, 10 years old.
Yeah.
I ran into this woman after I hadn't seen her for 2 years. I knew she was dying of brain cancer as a child. She didn't know that I knew. I never mourned it. I just told her how much she meant to me. I had mentioned something in my first couple of weeks of treatment to my counselor, and she keyed in on that moment. After 2 weeks, she brought it up in our therapy session. She said, "Tell me more about this woman, Rini." That was her name. And I fell to pieces in that therapy session. I fell to pieces.
You grieved, you mourned.
I mourned and grieved the loss of someone who was the most important person to me in those years.
Yeah, but you didn't fall to pieces. You just mourned.
I just mourned. That's right. I cried and I cried and I cried. I couldn't pull it back together in that session. But after that moment in my life, everything changed. It was no longer me against them. I thought to myself, maybe these people actually want to help me. I actually had that thought. Maybe they're not trying to make me do something that's not in my best interest, but maybe they really want to help me.
Yeah.
And I tell you that story because she held space for me to grieve.
Yeah.
For me, that's called love.
Yeah.
And you keyed in a moment ago and you said, not only would a therapist need to know about trauma, but they'd have to be in a certain kind of therapeutic relationship with their client.
Yeah.
And I would say that the key ingredient of those relationships with appropriateness is called love.
Well, first of all, it's a beautiful and also very illustrative story that you just told. And a number of points come up for me. One is that this supportive presence was in your life from age 3 to 8, but by the time you were 3, your worldview had been largely shaped already, because that happens almost from the moment of birth, even before birth, and with your interactions with your primary caregivers. So the sense of the world being against me, or you being against the world, predated this woman coming along.
Mm.
And it's like it's rooted in your nervous system for times for which you can have no possible recollection, because the part of the brain that recollects isn't even online till about that time.
Mm.
Number one. So that us, me against the world, was that you took into the recovery place, was basically a baseline, um, a baseline working theory of yours embedded in your nervous system.
Subconscious.
Subconsciously, yeah. Number one. Number two, we're wired for certain emotions. It's interesting how we use those phrases, falling to pieces and couldn't keep it together. Well, that's a certain way of looking at something already. Embedded in those phrases is a point of view.
Mm.
But actually, when you look at the brain and the human evolution as it determines the brain, we share with other mammals a number of emotional circuits. One of them is for grieving, so that humans aren't the only ones to grieve. Dolphins grieve, and mammal and I'm sorry, whales grieve, and elephants grieve, and certainly dogs grieve. And so that one of the needs of the child is to be able to experience all the range of emotions that nature endowed us with, and to have those emotions witnessed and validated.
Mm.
That never happened to you in your first years of life. When it did happen in that therapist's office, it's not that you fell apart or went to pieces.
Yes.
It's that you experienced something very human and had that witnessed and accepted and validated by an empathetic presence, your therapist. And then all of a sudden your worldview changed. No, maybe the whole world is not against me, So that's just the kind of experiences that people need when it comes to, because it's the shutdown of all that and the escape from the pain of it all. Because when a child grieves alone, a child can't grieve alone. It's way too painful. It's way too painful. And so we run away from our grief and our pain into our addictions.
Yes.
So to go back to your original question, that's exactly what needs to happen to people, is that they learn to experience themselves fully with the whole range of emotions in a way that's witnessed and validated. So they learn to accept themselves. You went in there with a huge self-rejection complex.
Yes.
You came out of that session much more self-accepting, that it's okay to grieve, what you call fall apart, and I'm not only am I still okay, I'm more than okay when I can have those emotions. So again, going back to your core question, so much more needs to happen in that process than simply the getting over the drug use or getting over the addictive behavior.
Yes.
So much more needs to happen. And that's exactly what's missing from so much addiction care.
That experience that I shared with you, I really look at that as the gateway or the beginning of my recovery.
Yeah. What comes up for me when you shed your tears, that was a real watershed for you. I mean, that's what it was.
Here's a watershed moment.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I tracking forward in recovery, the work, so my work on myself through recovery and my work with others and investigating and observing their experiences, it just occurs to me that, you know, the medicine that we don't often talk about is the medicine of connection and love. Even when people come to Recovery 2.0 and they're like, okay, I understand that morning yoga practice is a big thing for you guys. Okay, can you give me a morning practice? I'll come back in 2 months. You know, and I'm like, well, that's not exactly the process here. A big part of the process of recovery has always been to sit in circle, and to witness each other, and to share honestly from our heart. Which brings me to a really important question I wanted to ask you today. In your in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, your book, which really affected me. It was a very, I tell people, you have to read it, and it's a hard read in a lot of ways. In that book, you began with, you said, I'm a medical doctor, and if anyone's going to judge me on my record based upon the well-being of the clients that I see, anyone would have to say that I have failed. Because I'm up against, you know, addiction, and just take a look at the people that I'm serving. It's not gone well for them. But since that book was written, and since your experience in Vancouver's downtown east side and all those years you spent there, you've done a lot of work, and you've pursued a lot of things with regards to the healing of trauma and the modality, your process of compassionate inquiry. Would you report from the field that your record has improved some in these years?
Well, so there's a double answer to that question. I have to clarify that when I said that if the well-being of my patients is the measure of my success, then I was a failure, because my patients had HIV and they had wounds and abscesses and overdoses and all this stuff. But I wasn't saying that I was a failure. I was saying that if you judge it by a certain criteria, but actually that wasn't the criteria I was holding myself to. My criteria was I lessening their suffering? Was I helping them lead a better life, even within the limited circumstances of their skid-row existence? And even then, I didn't see myself as a failure. And the failure that I talked about,
that wasn't my insinuation.
I know it wasn't. I'm just clarifying it for your audience.
Yes.
No, I know that's not how you saw it. And I was really talking about more the fact that in a certain system, which ostracizes the drug addict and punishes them and doesn't provide the proper services, doesn't involve trauma-informed care, failure in the sense of redeeming people with that severely addicted population is almost inevitable. And I'd say that if I was still working in the downtown east side, in that narrow sense, I'd still be a quote-unquote failure, because there's more overdoses there now than there used to be. Life is rougher down there than it used to be when I was there. But that's for all kinds of political and economic and cultural reasons. So that's the first point. The second point, however, is that, yes, in my broader work since then, I've seen many people recover. And again, you and I talked about before about the meaning of this word recover, which means to find something. That's what it really means. You find something. But so what when you ask people, what did you find when you recover? They say, I found myself. And that disconnection from self is the essence of trauma. So yes, trauma can be healed. And I've seen it many times personally. I've also received many testimonials from people. So that, yes, it's healable depending on the right support and the right circumstances. And it's just an economic and racialized fact in our society that the people that need it most can afford it the least.
Mm.
You know, and so that you and I, in more than a relative sense, are belong to the privileged, you know, and for all their difficulties and travails and tribulations and troubles, the people that can come to you are also among the relatively privileged, which takes nothing away from their suffering. You know, yesterday I did a podcast with the actor David Duchovny, you know,
Mm.
from
Yes.
X-Files. And
Yes.
he's very public about an addiction that he used to have, you know, and he lived in the glittering world of Hollywood and so on. And you're close enough to that world. You live there or close to it. And from my visits there, there's a lot of suffering amongst all that glitter and gold and privilege and wealth. So we're not saying that people can't suffer, but the resources are totally unequally distributed,
Of course.
as you and I know.
Yes.
Yeah, those that can access the resources, healing is entirely possible.
Yes. I live in a city, Los Angeles, with 70,000 homeless people.
Yeah,
That's bigger than many cities.
yeah,
When I say that to people, they don't necessarily think I have the statistic correct.
Mm.
It's hard to imagine where would 70,000 people who have no home hang out? Where would you see them? Well, you see them everywhere.
yeah,
And sometimes I'll speak to these folks when I'm passing by, and I just recognize that they're just human beings.
yeah,
They're in difficult circumstances. I recognize immediately that I don't have a fix for it. I don't know what to do. That's the truth, and I feel it, and I just don't have a fix for it. I've decided to take a stand and try and do the work that I'm doing in the way that I'm doing it, and it will affect whoever's drawn to it and whoever can access it. But I don't have a fix for the 20 or 30 or 40 different variations of people who won't be able to find their way to Recovery 2.0 on a retreat with us to Costa Rica or India or Canada or the United States. Although, of course, they can access all of our content on YouTube, but even then, you would need somebody who has access to a computer. So there's all of these difficult realities about economics, and yeah, it's true. I don't have a fix for this, but I do feel I have to operate within my sphere of influence and do the best that I can.
Well, absolutely, and of course, it's the same for me. There are many things, terrible things happening in the world these days, as you and I know, and we watch them and we are helpless in the face of them.
Mm.
Not helpless in the sense that we can't do anything, but helpless in the sense that we're not going to change the overall picture by whatever we can do, and you have to accept your limitations there. These are larger social issues that are beyond the capacity of any one individual, and especially in the system. I mean, Ronald Reagan very famously said that the homeless are that way by choice, you know, which it's a choice they made, you know, I mean, which is like one of the most ignorant statements ever made by any I mean, but you know what, there's lots of competition for ignorant statements by completely ignorant politicians, but that one almost takes the cake, you know.
Yes.
So these are larger social questions, and we have to concentrate our work and energies or where we can make a difference.
Yes.
You know, at the same time, there are some people who devote their lives to working with that population and doing their best to mitigate their suffering and so on. And lots of organizations and people in LA who are trying to do that, but it's changing the overall situation is beyond them as well.
Yeah.
You know,
I want to speak to you about the concept of thinking differently within a system, operating either within or just outside of a system. There's a beautiful quote by a yoga teacher named very famous Krishnamurti.
Oh, yeah.
He said, it's no measure of success to be well adjusted to an extremely sick society.
Yeah. Yeah.
And from that perspective, it brings up questions about what is success? What are our strategies? Okay, so we've concluded that we live in a toxic society. There's lots and lots of problems. Okay, how can we operate so that we don't get drawn into the toxicity? How can we think different? How can we be different, but be here in the world and engage?
Well, you use the word success. So it begins with, what do we regard as success? Because we could regard as success acquisition and accumulation of wealth and possession of power and control and so on. We could regard that as success, which indeed what this society does hold out as the measure of success. But what if success was our capacity to connect with other human beings? What if success was our capacity to regulate ourselves in the face of life's challenges? You know, what if success was, that Beatles song, in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. I mean, what if that was our measure of success? So partly depends on what regard is successful. And I think both you and I know this because we both had a fair measure of worldly success. But at some point, it dawns on you that that's not what gives you inner satisfaction or peace. As gratifying it is to know that we're of help to others. Or no, I shouldn't put it that way. As gratifying it is made to know that we've achieved a certain measure of success in terms of recognition and people liking our work and so on. But ultimately, the success is how connected we feel with those people. Not what we've done, but the connection that we've able or not able to achieve. And in my book, The Myth of Normal, in the very last chapter, I referred to the psychologist Abraham Maslow, and Maslow is the one that came up with this hierarchy of human needs. And he actually studied people that were somewhat on the outside of society. They weren't rebels, they weren't oppositional, they weren't necessarily politically active, but they had their own set of values that was not determined by and overwhelmed by the values and expectations of society. And actually, let me find one of the benefits of being an author is you get to quote yourself.
Please.
But I just want to find this thing by Maslow because, So let me. Is it okay if I quote a paragraph here?
Of course.
Yeah. So
Please.
as it turns out, it is often individuals who define conventional normality who are the healthy ones. This is Maslow's finding, along the lines of the Krishnamurti citation that you gave. Psychologist Abraham Maslow made the investigation of self-actualization the attainment of authentic satisfaction, not based on external valuations, his life work. A study of people healthy enough to be self-actualized, he wrote in a widely read paper, revealed that they were not well adjusted in a naive sense of approval and identification with the culture. These healthy people, suggested Maslow, had a complex relationship with their, quote, much less healthy culture. An inner feeling, they were more true to their inner values, he says. An inner feeling of detachment from the culture was not necessarily conscious, but was displayed by almost all. They frequently were able to stand off from the culture as if they did not quite belong to it. And that's that old dynamic of being in the world, but not of it.
Precisely.
Not being defined by it. And what's really interesting, and I think you'll probably agree with this, that when people recover from addictions, that's exactly what they find. They find that when they really recover, not just stop the behavior, but really, become sober in the full sense of that word, not abstinent, but sober. And there's a distinction there. They actually find that they're no longer aligned with the values of the culture that shaped them. and they become their own agents in the
It,
world.
it's so interesting because often when people think about somebody on a spiritual path, or somebody like a yoga teacher, or someone who's studying yoga or studying some form of spirituality, they imagine that person becoming more tolerant, And the great irony here is that actually, as you awaken, you can be accepting but quite intolerant of what you're seeing, or in the sense of your preferences are a lot clearer to you.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, but tolerate. I mean, what does it mean to tolerate? It means that you put up with something.
Exactly.
That's really unpleasant. So the distinction you make is key. There's a difference between acceptance and tolerance.
Mm.
Toleration, like racial toleration. What a terrible concept.
That's
You
right.
tolerate somebody being of a different color. Who the hell are you to tolerate somebody else being a different color?
Mm.
Why is that why is that even something that you have to tolerate?
Mm. Yes.
So I mean, that's a very charged word. And uh, yeah, you become more accepting, but in a certain sense, less tolerant, less willing to put up with the inauthenticity,
Yes.
either in yourself or in the environment around you.
Well, I've noticed this interesting phenomenon. I want to run it by you. You know how when you have no money and you go to the bank for a loan, they won't give you any money.
Yeah,
But
when you need it, they won't give it to you.
right. But when you have lots of money, all of a sudden they start sending you letters. Hey, could we give you some more money?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm recognizing in myself in recovery and in many other people that I'm observing, if being seen and being loved is part of the medicine of resolving trauma. For me, at least, it seemed to be a prerequisite to me being able to get past certain things that were in my way, to be able to be comfortable in my own skin. That is to say, to be alone successfully. So this is not loneliness. This is the opposite of that. But having the ability, cultivated the ability to be alone, didn't come for me when I was so lonely. You know what I mean?
You know what? So isn't that interesting? Because this book I told you about, The Power of Discord by Ed Tronick, I was just reading this morning. Let me quote it to you. The capacity, he's quoting a great British psychiatrist called D.W. Winnicott. And Winnicott said, the capacity to be alone is based on the experience of being alone with someone, and that without a sufficiency of this experience, the capacity to be alone cannot develop. So that we developed the capacity to be alone precisely when we could be with somebody who would be attentive to us without interfering with us. And when we didn't have that attentive presence, or if that presence was an intrusive one, we don't develop the capacity to be alone. And in this book, I'm just reading because I'm interviewing the author this afternoon for the book that I'm now writing myself. But he says that the capacity to be alone is essential for being able to be intimate with another human being.
It's 100% correct. I'm quite sure that we're getting it backwards. We're trying to put the cart before the horse, trying to be in intimate relationships before we've developed the intimate relationship with self.
Exactly.
What a painful way to go about creating codependency in your life.
Well, exactly. And a lot of relationships are so codependent, in that sense. And also, of course, we have to make the obvious distinction between being alone and being lonely. It's not the same. I can be alone without being lonely. Mind you, can I be alone without reading a book or listening to music? Or that's a bit of a different story, we have to truly be able to be alone without the need to distract ourselves. in order to be able to be successfully in a healthy relationship.
Yes. Well, I'll out myself for a moment, but it's an interesting part of our society today. I lost my phone in India. I was just in India last month.
Oh,
Lost
wow.
my phone. And so I had an afternoon to myself.
Yes, freedom.
So I went to sit in a cafe, and I was going to meet somebody, and they were about a half an hour before I got there, a half an hour before they were going to arrive. And there I was,
Yeah, there you
sitting
were.
at a table in a busy cafe where everybody was either talking to each other or they were looking down at their phone. And I had no phone. I had no book. And I remarked to myself, oh my God, I'm addicted to everything.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
like, oh my God. When was the last time I sat amongst a group of people by myself and actually practiced just being there and not doing anything? It was, wow, what an uncomfortable experience.
Well, last summer, I may have told you this when we met, I've forgotten, but last summer, I found myself very stressed and overwhelmed by all that. I just engaged in too much activity. And somebody I know, actually a wonderful writer and playwright, her name is V, and she used to be known as Eve Ensler.
Yes.
Yeah. And so V suggested just take a 2-week break from digital media. So I shut off my cell phone, turned off my computer. Um, I didn't turn off my computer, but I turned off the Wi-Fi. So I wasn't getting any messages, emails, or cell phone calls or texts or anything. I wasn't looking at the news, wasn't checking the ranking of my books on Amazon, all the usual stuff that we do. And I started doing more yoga than I usually do and meditation. And I'm telling you, after 2 weeks, I was a different person.
Mm.
And what was interesting is that even knowing that the cell phone was on airplane mode, so I wouldn't be getting any messages or news, several times a day, I would just automatically still pick up the cell phone and I started looking at it. And I said, what am I doing? There's nothing here because it's shut off, but the automatic compulsion,
Yes.
it's amazing how
Eh,
powerful it is. And so that when we talk about addiction, um, that's the other thing. When you go back to your original question, okay, you leave the facility no longer being hooked on whatever substance, or perhaps you've made steps in recovering from your gambling or sex addiction or whatever. But how many other addictive and seductive behaviors out there in the society that are going to catch your attention like that,
mm.
unless you've developed some inner capacity to um, resist and hold yourself free of those blandishments. So that's another thing that needs to develop in people. It's not just overcoming the specific behavior, but the general tendency to get caught up in that very seductive and programmatically addictive culture that we live in.
That's right. Well, this is why, you know, the concept of one day at a time, the concept of consistency of some kind of program application, some kind of
Yeah,
curriculum that you can follow day in and day out is so critical, because it would take that person, that young man that I described to you earlier, Tommy Rosen, at 22 years old, it would take him so many years to even be able to think or ask the right questions,
yeah, that's
even to
right.
get to any of the answers that would ultimately lead to a comfort in my own skin. And there's a very powerful story that I heard from a great teacher in India, and it's the story of a Westerner looking for the great teaching, and he hears about a meditation master up in the Himalayas, and he goes and spends the weeks to try to find this guy and find the cave, the right cave where this guy has been meditating for years and years. And he finds it. He makes his way up, the Westerner does, up to this cave. And when he arrives there, the master is in meditation.
Mm.
And he observes him in meditation, and of course, the master is aware of his presence, and he pulls himself out of meditation. He opens his eyes and he says, sit down. And the first thing the Westerner says to him is, my goodness, you're so alone here. It must get very lonely.
Mm.
And the master, the yogi says to him, in my meditation, I experience no loneliness.
Mm.
Here with you, I feel very lonely.
Mm. Isn't that something?
And it was, so there's so much to be unpacked in that story. But again, this capacity to cultivate a comfort and an ease unto oneself.
Yeah.
The superpower of that in this society today is that's part of being in the world, but not of it. And I urge everybody everywhere to start a meditative practice and begin to relate to yourself in a deeper way.
And certainly in relationships, I mean, you probably know this from your own relationship, that sometimes the most lonely we can feel is in a relationship to another person.
Oh my goodness.
When the relationship is not working well. And when this guy Ed Tronick, who I keep talking about, he's the one that did the famous still face experiment, where a mother and infant are looking at each other and interacting, and all of a sudden the mother just presents a still mask of a face, and the infant does everything the infant can to bring the mother into a relationship. And if the mother maintains the still face, even for 15, 20 seconds, the infant is just totally upset, and so often in our relationships, because of our own early programming, we present this still face to the other person, and it drives the other person crazy not to have that sense of contact. So I can tell you, in my 55-year-old marriage now, I'm working my way out of it. But after only 55 years, people, it's possible. Just hang in there. But that feeling of being lonely in relation to another is just the worst thing.
So painful. And part of my journey with Kia has been and this has been the great calculus, is what's the difference between a want and a need?
Mm-hmm.
What needs to be worked out? What's my work versus what's the work of us together, or what's her work?
Yeah.
And separating that out, and wow, I mean, just even being able to discern, have that discernment, that has taken the better part of 20 years for me.
Well, and that's again an important distinction, because there's, broadly speaking, two large groups of people who can't distinguish between a want and a need. And the first one are toddlers. When they want a cookie, they think they need a cookie. And if they don't get the cookie, they go into an absolute meltdown.
Yes.
And addicts. Addicts truly believe that what they want, they need. And it reminds me of a great story with Bob Dylan. The young Bob Dylan was in a tour somewhere, and he's sitting in the back of the limo, and this young couple comes up to the car, and he rolls the window down, and they say, "Please give me your autograph," and Dylan says, "I don't want to give you your autograph. Please, your autograph." And Dylan just refuses. And this is in a documentary film about Dylan that I've seen. And the young man finally says, "Please, I need your autograph." And Dylan says, "No, you don't need my autograph. If you needed it, I would give it to you. But you don't need it." So, and this society thrives on blurring the distinction between what we want and what we need. And it creates all these pseudo needs that are nothing but wants. They're only needs in the sense of trying to fill some emptiness inside ourselves. But then, as you and I both know, that drive to fill the emptiness from the outside just leaves us even more empty in the end.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
but again, that distinction between want and need is a crucial one, and it drives a lot of people's lives, not knowing the difference.
Yes. The as I reflect on the last couple of years for me in recovery at this point, I'm thinking that, which partially led us to this, want to focus on the concept of life beyond addiction.
Yeah,
A big part of life beyond addiction is being able to sit in the discomfort of existence at times,
yeah,
to review where is this coming from. And the latest thing I'm working on in my meditation practice is, especially when I'm frustrated, distracted, lonely, whatever the thing is that's arising for me emotionally, if it's unpleasant, and it's not always unpleasant. Sometimes it's quite pleasant, but
yeah,
in the unpleasant meditation moments, I'm asking myself, who's here?
yeah,
It's just you, Tommy,
yeah.
and your breath and spirit, and sit here until you can find some peace.
Mm,
Just sit here until you can find some peace. And the reasons for which you would conclude this isn't a peaceful moment, whatever those reasons are, let them keep coming and sit long enough so you
mm,
run out of reasons.
mm,
And just be here and find the peace and the wonder of existence itself.
mm.
And some days this experiment goes better than others, but I like the practice, and I like where it's leading me, and it's forcing me to sit and explore the reasons why I think the moment is uncomfortable, when maybe it's just the mind, really.
Well, what always comes to mind about the mind is this song by Johnny Cash. It's called "In Your Mind," which have you ever heard it?
I don't know. In your mind? No, I don't think so.
Well, it's from the soundtrack to Dead Man Walking, that movie.
Okay.
And I think it's a song that Cash wrote himself, but I'm not sure. But anyway, the refrain goes, one foot on Jacob's ladder, another in the fire. It all goes down in your mind, And Jacob's ladder, of course, is the stairway to heaven.
Yes.
Long before Led Zeppelin existed, there was a stairway to heaven in the Bible.
Yes.
And, vision, and so, and one foot in the fire, which means hell. And whether you're heaven or hell, it all goes on in the mind. The
Mm,
mind creates it. And when you refer to just the hassle of existence, well, the Buddha talked about dukkha, the inherent unsatisfactoriness of the existence of the egoic mind. And uh, sometimes it can put us into hell or heaven,
mm,
but the Buddha also said, I often quote this from his collection of sayings, the Dhammapada, is that everything has mind in the lead.
mm,
So the mindset that we approach the world with will actually define the world that we live in. So you walk into this recovery center, it's me against them. Well, that's in your mind.
mm. Of course.
And then you have an experience that dissolves it, and all of a sudden you're living in a totally different world.
Mm,
The only place it happened was in your mind. Mind you, it happened in your mind in interaction with another human being.
mm.
But that's just our nature as interconnected beings.
That's right.
It does happen in the mind for sure. And I tell you, 3 days ago, as we speak, I just hated the world. I didn't want. I was really down, you
Mm,
know. And a day later, I wasn't, and nothing physically changed in my existence. I did have some good conversations, but the only thing that changed was my mindset.
yes. Beautiful. Well, I'm gonna leave it right there. Um, as always, Gabor, I'm super, super grateful to connect with you. And I love you. And I look forward to some time in 3 dimensions with you, if that's possible at some time
Yeah.
soon.
Yeah.
Can you tell people just before we go, what you're thinking about for this new book? I think you're writing with your son.
Yeah, so my son did help me write. My son Daniel did help me write The Myth of Normal, but that was largely my work. But he was instrumental in helping me write it.
Hmm.
But this one is, we're doing it 50-50. It's called Hello Again, a fresh start for parents and adult children.
Hmm.
And so that obviously we had our own dynamic to get through, to work through. It's also based on, in fact, when I was in Topanga, as you know, close to your own house, Diane and I were giving a workshop on that very
Workshop.
subject. And the commune, whom you know also very well, are putting out a film and a filmed course about our workshop
Beautiful.
sometime this year. Perhaps when you find out about it, you would let your community know about it.
Of course.
But that's the book that we're writing, and it should be published next year, late next year, I would think.
Beautiful. Called Hello Again.
Hello Again, a fresh start for parents and adult children.
Love it. Wonderful. Yeah. Gabor, thank you so much for, presenting, for your love and wisdom.